What if everything you think you know about human history is completely wrong? What if the story we've been told about our past, the one that starts with cave paintings and ends with smartphones, is actually just the latest chapter in a much longer, darker tale? What if civilizations far more advanced than ours have risen and fallen multiple times throughout history, leaving almost no trace behind? This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. This is about looking at the evidence with fresh eyes and asking uncomfortable questions. Because when you really examine the timeline we've been given, when you look at the mysterious gaps and sudden leaps in human development, something doesn't add up. The official story feels too clean, too convenient, too neat. Real progress isn't that smooth. Today, we're going to explore one of the most mind-bending possibilities in human history. The idea that our world has been reset more than once, that entire advanced civilizations have been wiped from existence, leaving future generations to start from scratch without even knowing what came before. And if this has happened before, there's a terrifying question we need to ask ourselves. Could it happen again? Let me start with something that should make you uncomfortable. We assume that because we can see 5,000 years of recorded history, that's the full story of human civilization. But here's the problem with that assumption. Humans, in our current form, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That means we have written records for less than 2% of our existence as a species. Think about that for a moment. 98% of human history is a complete mystery to us. We fill in those gaps with educated guesses, calling the people who lived then primitive hunter-gatherers. But what if they weren't primitive at all? What if some of them built cities, developed technologies, created art and literature that would amaze us today? What if they reached heights we haven't even imagined yet? The reason we don't know is simple. Almost everything humans create eventually disappears. Paper burns, metal rusts, wood rots. Even stone crumbles given enough time. Without constant maintenance and preservation, the greatest achievements of any civilization will vanish in just a few thousand years. Nature is incredibly efficient at erasing our footprints. But this raises a disturbing possibility. If an advanced civilization existed 20,000 years ago, or 50,000 years ago, and then collapsed completely, how much evidence would survive for us to find today? The answer is probably almost nothing. A few scattered artifacts buried deep underground, some strange anomalies that don't fit our current understanding. Maybe some stories passed down through oral tradition, transformed over countless generations into myths and legends. This isn't just theoretical speculation. We can see how quickly knowledge disappears even in recorded history. When the Roman Empire fell, much of Europe lost access to technologies they had used for centuries. Advanced engineering, sophisticated plumbing, even the recipe for certain types of concrete. These weren't primitive people, yet within a few hundred years, skills that had been common became completely forgotten. If something like that can happen to knowledge that's well documented and relatively recent, imagine what could happen to a civilization that existed in the distant past, before writing systems, before permanent records. A single catastrophic event could wipe out everything, leaving survivors who remember fragments but lack the infrastructure to rebuild. And catastrophic events aren't rare in Earth's history. They're normal. Massive volcanic eruptions that can plunge the world into years of darkness. Asteroid impacts that devastate entire continents. Ice ages that bury civilizations under miles of glacial ice. Sudden climate shifts that turn fertile lands into deserts overnight. These aren't science fiction scenarios. They've happened repeatedly throughout our planet's history. Consider the Toba supervolcano eruption that occurred roughly 74,000 years ago. Some scientists believe this event nearly wiped out humanity entirely, reducing our species to perhaps just a few thousand survivors. If there had been advanced societies before that eruption, they could have been completely erased. The few humans who survived would have been focused entirely on basic survival, with no time or resources to preserve the knowledge of their ancestors. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you start looking at human history with this possibility in mind, certain things become much harder to explain. There are sudden jumps in human development that seem to happen too quickly. Agriculture doesn't slowly develop over thousands of years. It appears almost simultaneously in multiple locations around the world, as if people everywhere suddenly remembered how to farm. Writing systems don't gradually evolve from simple marks to complex languages. They appear fully formed, sophisticated enough to record complex ideas and detailed information. Architecture doesn't slowly progress from simple shelters to massive stone monuments. We find incredible engineering feats that seem to come out of nowhere, built by people who supposedly had only basic tools. Take Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. This site features massive stone pillars arranged in complex patterns, some weighing up to 20 tons. Decorated with intricate carvings of animals and symbols. Mainstream archaeology dates it to about 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before anything we would recognize as civilization. According to our official timeline, the people who built this should have been nomadic hunter-gatherers with stone tools and animal skins, yet somehow they organized massive construction projects, transported enormous stones, and created art that rivals anything produced by later civilizations. How is that possible unless they inherited knowledge from somewhere else? Similar mysteries appear around the world. The precision stonework at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where massive blocks are fitted together so perfectly that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. The advanced astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures like Stonehenge and the Pyramid of Giza, which align perfectly with celestial events. The sophisticated mathematics found in ancient texts from India and Babylon, describing concepts that weren't supposed to be rediscovered until modern times. Each of these could be explained individually as remarkable achievements by unusually gifted ancient peoples. But when you see them as part of a pattern, they start to look like something else. Fragments of knowledge from earlier ages, pieces of a puzzle whose full picture we can't see because most of the pieces are missing. And then there are the myths. every culture on earth has stories about golden ages that ended in catastrophe, about floods that destroyed the world, about gods or advanced beings who taught humans the basics of civilization, about lost cities and vanished kingdoms that sank beneath the waves or were buried by disasters. We usually dismiss these as symbolic stories, moral lessons wrapped in fantasy. But what if there's something else? What if they're distorted memories of real events, passed down through countless generations until the facts became legends? The story of Atlantis, described by Plato as an advanced civilization that disappeared in a single day and night of misfortune, is the most famous example. But similar tales appear in cultures that had no contact with ancient Greece. Hindu texts speak of advanced cities destroyed by weapons that sound remarkably like nuclear explosions. Native American traditions tell of great floods and burning skies. Polynesian legends describe islands that vanished beneath the sea. These stories might be pure imagination, or they might be the only surviving records of civilizations that were erased so completely that we have no other evidence they ever existed. Cultural memory preserved in the only way possible when everything else is destroyed. This possibility changes everything about how we view our place in history. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, the inevitable result of steady progress from primitive beginnings. But what if we're not the first advanced civilization? What if we're just the latest in a series of rises and falls that stretches back tens of thousands of years? If that's true, then everything we've built, every achievement we're proud of, could be temporary. Our cities, our technology, our accumulated knowledge could all vanish just as completely as those hypothetical earlier civilizations. Future archaeologists might find scattered ruins of our skyscrapers and wonder how primitive people managed to build such things. The implications are both humbling and terrifying. Humbling because it means we're not special. We're not the chosen generation that finally figured everything out. We're just the current chapter in an ongoing story. Terrifying because if it's happened before, it could happen again. But before we explore what might cause such resets and whether we're vulnerable to experiencing one ourselves, we need to understand something crucial about the nature of knowledge and how quickly it can disappear. Because the speed at which civilizations can forget everything they once knew might be the key to understanding why earlier advanced societies left so little evidence. The truth about knowledge is that it's far more fragile than we realize. Most people assume that once something is discovered or invented, it becomes permanent. But that's not how it works at all. Knowledge exists in people's minds, in books, in tools, and in the systems that preserve and transmit information. Remove any of those elements, and entire fields of understanding can vanish within a single generation. Think about your own life for a moment. How many of the technologies you use every day do you actually understand well enough to recreate from scratch? You might know how to drive a car, but could you build an engine? You can use a smartphone, but do you know how to manufacture computer chips? Most of us rely on incredibly complex systems without having the slightest idea how they actually work. This specialization makes our modern world incredibly efficient, but it also makes it incredibly vulnerable. If the small number of experts who understand these systems were suddenly gone, their knowledge would die with them. The rest of us would be left with devices we can use but can't maintain, repair, or reproduce. History shows us just how quickly this can happen. When barbarian tribes overran the Western Roman Empire, they didn't just destroy buildings and kill people. They destroyed the entire network of knowledge that kept Roman civilization functioning. The skills needed to build aqueducts, create concrete, organize large-scale agriculture, and maintain complex legal systems were concentrated in relatively few hands. When those people were gone, the knowledge went with them. Within just a few centuries, techniques that had been commonplace for hundreds of years became completely lost. It wasn't until the Renaissance, over 1,000 years later, that Europeans rediscovered some of these Roman innovations. And even today, archaeologists are still trying to figure out exactly how the Romans made certain types of concrete that were stronger and more durable than anything we can produce. If this kind of knowledge loss can happen in recorded history, imagine what could occur during a truly catastrophic reset. Picture an advanced civilization 20,000 years ago, with cities, technology, and accumulated wisdom built up over millennia. Then imagine a series of disasters striking in rapid succession. Maybe a massive volcanic eruption blocks out the sun for years, causing global crop failures. Maybe earthquakes and tsunamis destroy the major population centers. Maybe disease sweeps through the surviving communities. The immediate priority for any survivors would be basic survival, finding food, shelter, and safety. The specialists who understood the complex technologies would likely be among the first casualties, either killed directly by the disasters or dying from the harsh conditions that followed. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to maintain the old systems would be completely gone. The survivors would rebuild based on whatever they could remember and whatever skills were most immediately useful. They might recall fragments of the old knowledge, but without the full context, these memories would be incomplete and eventually distorted. A story about flying machines might become a legend about gods who traveled through the sky. A memory of powerful weapons might transform into myths about divine lightning bolts. This process of forgetting isn't just theoretical. We can see it happening in isolated communities that have been cut off from the larger world. Groups that once had access to metal tools have reverted to using stone implements when trade networks collapsed. Societies that once built in stone have switched to wood and mud when they lost the knowledge of quarrying and construction techniques. The rate at which knowledge disappears depends on how complex it is and how many people understand it. Simple, practical skills like farming, hunting, and basic crafts tend to survive because they're widely practiced and immediately useful. But advanced scientific and technical knowledge is much more vulnerable. If only a few hundred people in the world truly understand quantum physics, and they're all eliminated by some catastrophe, that entire field of study could vanish completely. Even language plays a crucial role in preserving knowledge. If future generations can't read the texts left behind by their ancestors, all the information contained in those writings becomes inaccessible. We face this problem today with ancient scripts that we still haven't deciphered. The information is physically there, carved in stone or written on durable materials, but it might as well not exist if we can't understand what it says. The environment accelerates this forgetting process dramatically. In hot, humid climates, organic materials decay within decades. In deserts, sand can bury entire cities. In forests, vegetation quickly reclaims any cleared areas. If you abandoned a modern city today and left it completely unmaintained, within 500 years, it would be almost unrecognizable. In 5,000 years, there might be nothing left but scattered concrete foundations and some metal artifacts. This is why the idea of historical resets is so compelling and so disturbing. It suggests that the process of forgetting isn't just a side effect of civilization collapse. It's the main reason we don't know about previous advanced societies. The speed at which human knowledge can disappear means that even the greatest achievements of past civilizations could vanish almost completely, leaving only enough traces to make us wonder what we're missing. But forgetting doesn't happen in isolation. It's accelerated by active destruction, by the deliberate erasure of inconvenient truths, and by the simple human tendency to rewrite history to fit our current understanding of the world. When civilizations collapse and rebuild, they don't just lose knowledge. They actively reshape the story of what came before. This rewriting process is so consistent and so powerful that it might be one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the reset hypothesis. Because if history has been restarted multiple times, we should expect to find exactly what we do find. Gaps in the record. Sudden, unexplained advances, myths that hint at lost knowledge, and a timeline that feels too clean and convenient to be completely accurate. The victors don't just write history, they reshape it entirely. They take the fragments of memory that survive and weave them into narratives that make sense within their own worldview. Technologies become magic. Historical figures become gods. Real events become symbolic stories. And over time, these rewritten versions become the only versions that remain. This means that even our best efforts to reconstruct the past might be built on layers of altered memory. We might be living in a world that has been reset multiple times, but we can't see it because each reset rewrites the story of what came before. The evidence is there, scattered in anomalous artifacts, encoded in ancient myths, and hidden in the gaps between what we know and what we think we know. And if this process has happened before, it raises the most unsettling question of all. Are we living through the peak of our own cycle? Have we reached the point where our civilization is most vulnerable to the kinds of catastrophic events that could trigger another reset? Because if the pattern holds, if history truly has been restarted multiple times, then our turn might be coming sooner than we think. The forces that could cause such a reset aren't distant threats from science fiction movies. They're real. They're present in our world today, and some of them are more dangerous now than they've ever been before. Understanding these threats isn't about creating fear. It's about recognizing the fragility of everything we've built and the importance of the choices we make right. Because when you examine the forces that have shaped our planet throughout its history, you realize that catastrophic resets aren't rare exceptions. They're normal features of life on Earth. And some of the most powerful reset mechanisms are completely beyond human control, operating on scales that make our entire civilization seem like a brief flicker in cosmic time. Let's start with the most obvious threat: volcanic activity. Not the kind of eruption that makes headlines for a few days, but supervolcanic events that can alter the climate of the entire planet. The Yellowstone caldera, sitting beneath one of America's most famous national parks, is actually a sleeping giant that has erupted catastrophically 3 times in the past 2 million years. When it goes off again, and geological evidence suggests it will, the explosion will be roughly 1,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. But even Yellowstone pales in comparison to some of the volcanic events in Earth's history. The Toba eruption in Indonesia, which occurred roughly 74,000 years ago, ejected so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it may have blocked sunlight for several years. Temperatures dropped globally. Plants died. Food chains collapsed. Some scientists believe this single event reduced the human population to fewer than 10,000 individuals worldwide. Now imagine if that eruption had happened during the height of a technologically advanced civilization. Cities would have been buried under meters of ash. Agricultural systems would have failed completely. The complex supply chains that keep modern societies functioning would have snapped immediately. Within months, most of the population would have starved. Within years, the survivors would be scattered into small groups focused entirely on immediate survival. The knowledge needed to rebuild would die with the specialists who possessed it. Future generations might find the ruins, but without context, they'd have no idea what they were looking at. A nuclear power plant might seem like a temple. A computer might be interpreted as a magical artifact. The technology that once defined an entire civilization would become incomprehensible relics. But volcanoes are just one of nature's reset mechanisms. Earthquakes can be equally devastating, especially when they strike at the heart of a civilization's infrastructure. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, one of the most prepared and technologically advanced nations on Earth, came close to triggering a nuclear catastrophe that could have made large parts of the country uninhabitable for decades. Now consider what a similar event might do to a hypothetical ancient advanced civilization. If their major cities were built along coastlines, as ours are today, a massive tsunami could wipe out the majority of their population and infrastructure in a matter of hours. The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would face the impossible task of rebuilding without the industrial base that made their technology possible in the first place. Then there's ice. During the last ice age, glaciers covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere, grinding mountains into valleys and completely reshaping the landscape. When the ice finally melted, sea levels rose by more than 400 feet, flooding coastal areas that had been the dry land for thousands of years. If advanced civilizations had existed in those areas, their remains would now be buried under hundreds of feet of ocean water. This isn't just speculation. We're already finding submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean that suggest sophisticated societies once existed in areas that are now underwater. But these discoveries represent only the tiniest fraction of what might be hidden beneath the waves. The vast majority of the ocean floor remains completely unexplored. Climate change, whether natural or human-caused, presents another pathway to civilizational collapse. The shift from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age, a relatively minor climate fluctuation, was enough to cause widespread famine, social upheaval, and political instability across Europe. A more dramatic climate shift could render entire regions uninhabitable, forcing massive population migrations and the collapse of established social orders. What makes these natural reset mechanisms so effective isn't just their destructive power. It's their ability to erase evidence. Volcanic ash buries cities so completely that they vanish from sight for thousands of years. Rising seas swallow coastal civilizations and hide them on the ocean floor. Ice grinds human structures into dust and scatters the remains across vast distances. Over time, nature heals itself, covering the scars with new growth until it looks as if nothing had ever been there. But nature isn't the only force capable of triggering resets. Human actions can be equally devastating, especially when they target the foundations of knowledge and culture that hold civilizations together. War doesn't just destroy buildings and kill people. It systematically dismantles the networks of information and expertise that make complex societies possible. Consider what happened to the ancient Library of Alexandria. This wasn't just a building full of books. It was the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean world, containing centuries of accumulated knowledge in science, mathematics, literature, and philosophy. When it was destroyed, whether by fire, conquest, or gradual neglect, the loss wasn't just cultural. It represented a massive step backward in human understanding that took centuries to recover from. The same pattern repeats throughout history. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in the 13th century eliminated one of the world's greatest centers of learning. The Spanish conquest of the Americas led to the systematic burning of Maya and Aztec codices, wiping out entire systems of knowledge about astronomy, medicine, and engineering. World War II saw the destruction of countless libraries, museums, and archives across Europe and Asia. Each of these events represents a partial reset, a breaking of the chain that connects one generation's knowledge to the next. But they also show us how quickly and completely information can disappear when the systems that preserve it are deliberately targeted. A more systematic campaign of destruction or a series of conflicts that disrupted civilization on a global scale could trigger a complete reset that would leave future generations starting almost from scratch. Modern warfare presents even greater risks. Nuclear weapons don't just destroy cities. They can render large areas uninhabitable for decades or centuries. A full-scale nuclear exchange would not only kill hundreds of millions of people directly, it would also trigger a nuclear winter that could disrupt agriculture worldwide. The electromagnetic pulses generated by high-altitude nuclear detonations could fry the electronic systems that our civilization depends on, sending us back to a pre-industrial level of technology almost overnight. But perhaps the most insidious threat comes from the gradual erosion of knowledge through more subtle processes. Famine doesn't just kill people. It breaks down the social structures that preserve and transmit complex information. When people are focused entirely on finding their next meal, they don't have time to maintain libraries, teach advanced skills, or preserve cultural traditions. Disease can be equally devastating to the continuity of knowledge. The Black Death didn't just kill a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. It eliminated entire guilds of skilled craftsmen, disrupted educational institutions, and created such social chaos that many advanced techniques were simply forgotten. If a similar pandemic struck today, targeting the relatively small number of experts who understand our most complex technologies, the loss could be catastrophic. What makes all of these threats particularly dangerous is that they don't need to destroy everything to trigger a reset. They just need to disrupt the systems that maintain our technological civilization long enough for the knowledge to be lost. Once the chain of transmission is broken, once the experts are gone and the infrastructure has decayed, rebuilding becomes exponentially more difficult. This is especially true in our modern world, where knowledge has become increasingly specialized and interconnected. Few people understand how to manufacture computer chips, but without those chips, most of our technology becomes useless. Even fewer people know how to design and build the machines that make the chips, or how to refine the raw materials those machines require. If something disrupted this complex web of interdependencies, we might find ourselves unable to maintain the very technologies that define our civilization. The digital age has made this problem even more acute. We've moved most of our information into electronic formats that require constant power and maintenance to remain accessible. If the electrical grid failed permanently, if the internet went down and stayed down, if the data centers that store our collective knowledge were destroyed, we could lose more information in a few years than was accumulated over centuries. Future archaeologists might find our cities, but without the context provided by our digital records, they'd have no idea how our society actually functioned. They might see the ruins of factories and power plants without understanding the complex economic and technological systems that made them possible. They might find smartphones and computers without having any clue what they were used for or how they worked. This isn't science fiction. It's a realistic assessment of our vulnerability to the same kinds of catastrophic events that may have reset human civilization in the past. The difference is that we might be even more vulnerable than our predecessors, because we've built our entire way of life around systems that are incredibly powerful, but also incredibly fragile. The question isn't whether these reset mechanisms exist or whether they could affect us. They do exist, and history shows us that they've been active throughout Earth's past. The question is whether we're approaching a point in our own cycle where we're most vulnerable to experiencing a reset ourselves. And when you look at the current state of the world, when you examine the mounting pressures on our technological civilization, the signs are troubling. We're facing multiple potential triggers simultaneously. Climate change is accelerating. Political tensions are rising. Our technological systems are becoming more complex and therefore more vulnerable to cascading failures. We're more dependent than ever on global supply chains and electronic infrastructure that could be disrupted by natural disasters, cyber attacks, or geopolitical conflicts. But perhaps most concerning of all is our collective amnesia about the fragility of what we've built. We've become so accustomed to technological convenience that we've forgotten how quickly it could all disappear. We take for granted that the lights will always turn on, that food will always be available in the supermarkets, that the internet will always work. This complacency might be our greatest vulnerability, because if history has taught us anything, it's that civilizations don't usually see their own collapse coming. They believe they're different, that they've solved the problems that brought down their predecessors, that their achievements will last forever. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It shows us that even the mightiest empires eventually fall, that even the most advanced societies can vanish, that even the greatest accumulations of knowledge can be lost. The reset hypothesis suggests that this process isn't an accident or an exception. It's part of a larger pattern that has repeated itself multiple times throughout human history. We might be living through just the latest iteration of a cycle that stretches back tens of thousands of years, each rise and fall leaving only faint traces for the next civilization to puzzle over. If that's true, then understanding this pattern isn't just an academic exercise. It's a survival issue. Because the better we understand how resets happen and what triggers them, the better chance we have of either preventing one or surviving it with more of our knowledge intact. The story of human history might not be the steady march of progress we've been taught to believe in. It might be something far stranger and more cyclical. A series of worlds rising and falling, each one building on the fragments left behind by its predecessors, each one believing it represents the pinnacle of human achievement. And somewhere in that cycle, we might find the key to breaking free from the pattern entirely. Or we might discover that we're already too late, that the forces of reset are already in motion, and that our time as the dominant civilization on Earth is drawing to a close. The most chilling part isn't that these resets could happen. It's that they might already be happening right now, and we're too caught up in our daily routines to notice the warning signs. Because here's what nobody wants to talk about. Our modern civilization, for all its apparent strength, might actually be more fragile than any society that came before us. We've created a world that depends entirely on incredibly complex systems, working perfectly all the time. Your morning coffee relies on global supply chains. Your smartphone connects to satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth. Your electricity comes from power grids that span entire continents. Remove any one of these elements, and the whole structure starts to wobble. Ancient civilizations were different. When the Roman roads were blocked, people could still walk. When the aqueducts failed, there were wells and rivers. When the government collapsed, local communities could still function. They had what we call redundancy, multiple ways to accomplish the same essential tasks. We've traded that redundancy for efficiency. And efficiency, while it makes life incredibly convenient, also makes systems incredibly brittle. When everything is optimized to work perfectly under ideal conditions, there's no backup plan when those conditions change. Let me give you a concrete example that should keep you awake at night. Most major cities keep only about 3 days' worth of food in their supermarkets at any given time. 3 days? If the trucks stopped coming, if the distribution centers went offline, if the just-in-time delivery systems that keep our shelves stocked suddenly failed, you'd have widespread panic and social breakdown within a week. This isn't theoretical. We saw glimpses of it during the early days of the pandemic when people couldn't find toilet paper or hand sanitizer. That was just a minor supply disruption caused by changes in demand. Imagine what would happen if the supply chains themselves were damaged or destroyed. But food is just the beginning. Our entire financial system exists as numbers in computer databases. If those databases were corrupted or destroyed, if the networks that connect banks around the world went down permanently, the concept of money as we know it would simply cease to exist. People would be forced back into barter systems literally overnight. Communication would collapse just as quickly. We've become so dependent on cell phones and the internet that most people don't even know their friends' phone numbers anymore. If the cellular networks failed, if the fiber optic cables were cut, if the satellites were knocked out of orbit, we'd lose the ability to coordinate any kind of organized response to whatever crisis caused the breakdown in the first place. The scary thing is that all of these systems are connected. The internet needs electricity to function. The power grid needs computerized controls to manage distribution. The transportation networks that deliver fuel to power plants depend on GPS satellites for navigation. It's all one giant, interconnected web. And if you pull on any thread hard enough, the whole thing can unravel. This interconnectedness means that a reset today wouldn't need to be caused by a massive natural disaster or a global war. It could be triggered by something much smaller, a solar storm that fries electronic circuits, a cyber attack that takes down critical infrastructure, even a coordinated campaign by hackers targeting the industrial control systems that manage everything from water treatment plants to electrical substations. The Carrington event of 1859 gives us a preview of what a major solar storm could do. Back then, it was powerful enough to make telegraph lines spark and catch fire. Telegraph operators received electric shocks. Some telegraph systems continued working even after being disconnected from their power sources, running purely on the induced electrical currents from the geomagnetic disturbance. That was when our most advanced technology was the telegraph. Today, a similar event would be catastrophic. Satellites would be fried. Power grids would overload and shut down. GPS systems would fail. The electronic ignition systems in most modern cars wouldn't work. Even if you had a car that could run, there'd be no way to pump gasoline because the pumps are all computerized. Within days, maybe hours, we'd be thrown back to a 19th century level of technology. But here's the crucial difference. People in the 19th century knew how to live without electricity. They knew how to preserve food without refrigeration, how to navigate without GPS, how to communicate without phones. Most of us don't. We've become so specialized, so dependent on our technological systems, that we've lost the basic survival skills that our great-grandparents took for granted. How many people today know how to grow their own food, how to purify water, how to make tools from raw materials? How many could even start a fire without matches or a lighter? This learned helplessness makes us incredibly vulnerable to any disruption of our normal systems. And it means that if a reset were to occur, the recovery would be much slower and more difficult than it might have been for previous civilizations. We'd have to relearn everything from scratch, and we'd be doing it while dealing with the trauma and chaos of societal collapse. But there's another factor that makes a modern reset particularly dangerous: the sheer scale of our population. There are nearly 8 billion people on Earth right now, and most of them live in cities that produce no food and have no access to clean water without technological intervention. If the systems that support urban populations failed, the humanitarian crisis would be unlike anything in recorded history. Previous resets might have affected millions of people. A modern reset could affect everyone on the planet simultaneously. And unlike our ancestors, who lived in smaller, more dispersed communities, we've concentrated ourselves into massive population centers that would become death traps if the infrastructure supporting them collapsed. The environmental damage would be catastrophic too. Nuclear power plants need constant cooling and monitoring to prevent meltdowns. Chemical factories store massive quantities of toxic materials that could leak if their containment systems failed. Even our attempts to clean up after ourselves depend on complex technological processes that might not survive a major disruption. So we could be looking at a reset that's not just social and technological, but environmental as well. Future civilizations might inherit a planet that's been poisoned by the collapse of our industrial systems. They might have to spend centuries just making the Earth habitable again before they could even think about rebuilding. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all. What if we're not just vulnerable to a reset? What if we're actively causing one right now through our own actions? Climate change isn't just about rising sea levels and extreme weather. It's about the breakdown of the stable environmental conditions that allowed our civilization to flourish in the first place. The agricultural systems that feed billions of people depend on predictable rainfall patterns and stable temperatures. Ocean currents that regulate global climate could shut down if too much fresh water from melting ice sheets disrupts their circulation. We're conducting a massive experiment with the only planet we have, and we don't really know how it's going to turn out. But if history has been reset before by natural climate changes, then the artificial climate change we're causing now could trigger another reset, even without any external catastrophe. The timeline would be slower than a volcanic eruption or asteroid impact, but the end result could be the same: gradual breakdown of agricultural systems, mass migration as entire regions become uninhabitable, resource wars as nations fight over dwindling supplies of fresh water and arable land, the slow-motion collapse of the complex systems that keep our civilization running. And because it would happen gradually, we might not recognize it as a reset until it was too late to stop. Each crisis would seem manageable on its own. Each breakdown would appear to be a temporary setback that we could overcome with the right policies or technologies, but collectively they could add up to the end of the world as we know it. This is how most resets probably happen, not with a bang, but with a whimper. A series of cascading failures that seem unrelated at first, but eventually overwhelm a civilization's ability to respond. The people living through it might not even realize they're experiencing a reset until their grandchildren are telling stories about the old days when machines could fly and people could talk to anyone in the world instantly. But here's what makes this possibility even more unsettling. If resets are a recurring pattern in human history, if they've happened multiple times before, then maybe they're not accidents at all. Maybe they're built into the system somehow. Maybe there are forces at work, whether natural or artificial, that periodically wipe the slate clean and force humanity to start over. Some researchers have suggested that resets might even be intentional, that there could be groups or entities, human or otherwise, with the power and motivation to deliberately collapse civilizations when they reach certain levels of development. This might sound like conspiracy theory territory, but when you consider how easily our interconnected systems could be disrupted by someone with the right knowledge and resources, it's not as far-fetched as it initially seems. A coordinated attack on just a few dozen critical infrastructure nodes could probably bring down most of the developed world. The expertise needed to carry out such an attack exists. The motivation could be anything from ideological extremism to a misguided attempt to prevent some greater catastrophe. And the perpetrators might genuinely believe they're doing humanity a favor by forcing us to rebuild in a more sustainable way. Whether resets are natural, accidental, or intentional, the pattern seems clear. Civilizations rise, they reach a point of maximum complexity and vulnerability, and then they fall. The survivors pick up the pieces and start the process over again. Each cycle might last thousands of years, but from the perspective of geological time, they're just brief, flickering moments. We might be living through the peak of our own cycle right now, the point where our civilization is most advanced, most powerful, and most vulnerable to collapse. All the warning signs are there if you know how to look for them. The increasing complexity of our systems, the growing interdependence of global networks, the concentration of knowledge in the hands of relatively few specialists, the loss of practical skills that previous generations took for granted, even our collective amnesia about the fragility of what we've built fits the pattern. Previous civilizations probably felt the same way. They probably thought their achievements were permanent, that they had solved the problems that brought down their predecessors, that they were different from everyone who came before. But the archaeological record suggests otherwise. It shows us that even the mightiest empires eventually crumble, that even the most sophisticated technologies can be forgotten, that even the greatest accumulations of knowledge can vanish without a trace. If the reset hypothesis is correct, then we're not the pinnacle of human achievement. We're just the latest chapter in a much longer story. And like all the chapters before us, our time will eventually come to an end. The question isn't whether this will happen. If the pattern holds, it's inevitable. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we use it to try to break the cycle, to build systems that are more resilient and knowledge that's more likely to survive? Do we prepare for the possibility of collapse by preserving essential information and skills? Or do we ignore the warning signs, convince ourselves that we're different, and sleepwalk into the same fate that may have befallen countless civilizations before us? Because if history really has been reset more than once, if we really are living on the ruins of worlds we can barely imagine, then the choices we make in the next few decades might determine not just our own fate, but the fate of whoever comes after us. The evidence is all around us, scattered in myths and anomalies, hidden in the gaps between what we know and what we think we know. The question is whether we're brave enough to face the possibility that our entire understanding of human history might be wrong, and wise enough to learn from mistakes we didn't even know we were repeating. The most terrifying aspect of all this isn't the possibility that resets have happened before. It's the speed at which they could happen again. We've convinced ourselves that collapse is a gradual process, something that takes generations to unfold. But that's not what the evidence shows us. When complex systems fail, they don't slowly wind down like an old clock. They snap. Look at how quickly things can change in our modern world. The 2008 financial crisis went from a few bad mortgages to global economic meltdown in a matter of months. The COVID pandemic shut down entire countries within weeks. These weren't gradual processes that people saw coming years in advance. They were sudden, cascading failures that caught almost everyone off guard. Now imagine something similar happening to our entire technological civilization. Not just the economy or public health, but everything at once. The power grid, the internet, transportation systems, food distribution, water treatment, manufacturing, banking, communications. All of it failing simultaneously, each breakdown triggering others in an unstoppable chain reaction. This isn't science fiction speculation. It's what systems theorists call a cascading failure. And it's exactly what we should expect from any network as interconnected and optimized as ours has become. We've built a house of cards that reaches higher than any civilization in history, but we've forgotten that the higher it gets, the harder it falls. The digital revolution has made this vulnerability exponentially worse. 50 years ago, if you wanted to destroy someone's records, you had to physically burn their libraries and filing cabinets. Today, you can erase petabytes of information with a few keystrokes. We've moved our entire collective memory into systems that can be wiped out faster than any book burning in history. Think about what would happen if a massive electromagnetic pulse, whether from a solar storm or a high-altitude nuclear detonation, fried every electronic device on Earth. Not just temporarily, but permanently. Every computer, every smartphone, every piece of digital storage would be instantly reduced to expensive paperweights. The knowledge stored in those devices wouldn't just be inaccessible. It would be gone forever. We'd lose more information in a single day than was accumulated over centuries. Technical manuals, scientific databases, cultural archives, personal records, financial information, maps, communication networks. All of it vanishing in the time it takes for an electromagnetic wave to circle the globe. The survivors would find themselves in a world full of machines they couldn't operate and buildings they couldn't understand. They'd see the physical infrastructure of our civilization, but they'd have no idea how any of it worked. Nuclear power plants would become mysterious temples. Airports would be incomprehensible monuments. Computer factories would be as puzzling as ancient ruins. Within a generation, maybe less, the survivors would develop new stories to explain what they saw. The tall buildings would become the dwellings of giants. The highways would be paths built by gods. The satellites, if any were still visible, would become celestial spirits watching over the earth. This is exactly how myths are born, not as pure fantasy, but as attempts by people to make sense of things they can no longer understand. If advanced civilizations really have risen and fallen before, their remnants would have been just as puzzling to the people who came after. The stories we dismiss as mythology might actually be distorted memories of technologies that once existed but were lost to time. And here's what makes this even more unsettling. The process of forgetting isn't random. It follows predictable patterns. The most complex knowledge disappears first because it depends on the largest number of specialists. Basic survival skills survive longer because more people know them and they're immediately useful. But everything in between gets lost in a kind of intellectual middle ground where it's too complicated for most people to maintain, but not essential enough to prioritize during a crisis. This explains why, if resets have happened before, we might find evidence of both primitive and advanced technologies existing simultaneously. The advanced stuff would be remnants of the previous civilization, preserved by chance or copied without full understanding. The primitive stuff would be what the survivors developed when they had to rebuild from scratch. We see hints of this pattern in our own archaeological record. Ancient sites with precision stonework that we can barely replicate today, sitting next to crude pottery and simple tools. Advanced astronomical knowledge preserved in cultures that supposedly had no written language. Mathematical concepts encoded in monuments built by people we're told were barely past the hunter-gatherer stage. Each of these anomalies could be explained away individually, but collectively they paint a picture of a world where advanced and primitive technologies coexisted because the advanced ones were inherited rather than invented by the people who used them. If that's true, then our own advanced technologies might not be as secure as we think. We've built them on foundations that could crumble just as completely as whatever came before us. The difference is that our collapse, when it comes, might be even more thorough than previous ones because we put all our eggs in such a fragile basket. Previous civilizations might have had more diverse knowledge systems. Some information stored in books some in oral traditions, some in physical structures that could survive disasters. We've concentrated almost everything in digital formats that could vanish instantaneously if the power went out permanently. But the real tragedy wouldn't be the loss of information itself. It would be the loss of context. Future archaeologists might find our smartphones, but without the internet, without the software, without the entire technological ecosystem that made them work, they'd just be mysterious rectangles of glass and metal. They might find our cities, but without understanding how electricity worked, how supply chains functioned, how global communication networks operated, they'd have no idea how 8 billion people managed to live together on the same planet without constant warfare over resources. The complexity of our civilization, which we see as its greatest strength, could become its greatest weakness in the eyes of future historians. They might conclude that such a system was impossible, that the ruins they found must have been built by beings with capabilities far beyond normal humans. Gods, aliens, lost advanced races, anything except people like themselves who simply had better tools. This is how we ended up with ancient astronaut theories and lost Atlantis speculations. Not because people are gullible or unscientific, but because the alternative, that ordinary humans once possessed knowledge and capabilities that were later completely forgotten, seems almost as impossible to believe. Yet that's exactly what the reset hypothesis suggests. That ordinary humans, people just like us, have repeatedly built civilizations as advanced as ours, only to see them collapse so completely that later generations couldn't imagine how such things were possible. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond academic curiosity about the past. If resets are a recurring pattern, if they represent some kind of natural cycle or built-in limitation to how far human civilizations can advance before they become too unstable to maintain, then we need to fundamentally rethink our assumptions about progress and permanence. We assume that knowledge once gained becomes permanent, that technologies once invented will never be lost, that progress moves in only one direction, always building on previous achievements. But what if that's not how it works? What if there are natural limits to how much complexity any civilization can sustain before it becomes too fragile to survive the inevitable shocks that life throws at it? What if the pattern we're seeing, the repeated cycles of rise and fall, represents not failure, but a kind of natural regulation? A way for the system to reset itself when it becomes too top-heavy, too specialized, too dependent on conditions that can't be maintained indefinitely. From this perspective, resets wouldn't be disasters to be prevented. They'd be necessary corrections, ways of wiping the slate clean so that life can try again with a fresh start. The knowledge that gets lost wasn't meant to be permanent. It was just one experiment among many. And when the experiment reached its limits, the system reset itself to try something different. This doesn't make the prospect of experiencing a reset any less terrifying for those of us living through it. But it might explain why the pattern seems so consistent, why civilizations throughout history have followed such similar trajectories despite having no contact with each other. Maybe there really are natural laws governing the rise and fall of complex societies. Maybe we're not the masters of our own destiny that we like to think we are. Maybe we're participants in a much larger process that operates according to rules we don't understand and can't control. If that's the case, then trying to prevent the next reset might be as futile as trying to prevent winter from following autumn. The best we could hope for would be to influence how the reset happens, to ensure that some essential knowledge survives the collapse so that the next civilization doesn't have to start completely from scratch. But even that assumes we can recognize when a reset is beginning, that we can distinguish between temporary setbacks and the start of genuine civilizational collapse. History suggests that people living through these events rarely understand what's happening to them until it's too late to change course. The Romans didn't wake up one day and decide to let their empire fall. The Maya didn't choose to abandon their cities. The people of Easter Island didn't deliberately cut down their last tree. These collapses happened gradually through a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but collectively led to disaster. We might be making similar choices right now without realizing it. Our pursuit of efficiency over resilience, our faith in technological solutions to fundamental problems, our tendency to assume that current trends will continue indefinitely. All of these could be setting us up for the same kind of collapse that may have befallen our predecessors. The scariest part is that we might not even recognize the warning signs because they're embedded in the very things we're most proud of. Our global connectivity, our technological sophistication, our ability to support massive populations in urban environments. These achievements might also be the vulnerabilities that make us susceptible to the next reset. Previous civilizations probably felt the same way about their own accomplishments. They probably looked at their great cities, their impressive monuments, their sophisticated technologies, and assumed they represented permanent progress rather than temporary peaks that would inevitably be followed by valleys. But if the reset hypothesis is correct, if history really has been restarted multiple times, then permanence is an illusion. Everything we've built, everything we've learned, everything we think makes us special could vanish just as completely as whatever came before us. The only question is whether we'll learn from this possibility or repeat the same mistakes that may have been made countless times before, whether we'll use our knowledge of the pattern to break free from it, or whether we'll convince ourselves that we're different and sleepwalk into the same fate that may have befallen every advanced civilization that ever existed. Because if the pattern holds, if resets really are inevitable, then we're not just living through another chapter in human history. We're living through the latest iteration of a cycle that stretches back far longer than we've ever imagined. Each rise and fall, leaving only whispers and fragments for the next world to discover and misunderstand. The story of human civilization might not be a single narrative of progress and achievement. It might be something far stranger and more humbling, an endless loop of forgetting and rediscovering, of building and collapsing, of reaching for the stars only to fall back to earth and start the whole process over again. And if that's true, then the most important question isn't whether we can prevent the next reset. It's whether we can break the cycle entirely, or whether we're doomed to repeat it forever, each civilization thinking it's the first to reach such heights, never knowing that others have stood exactly where we stand now and faced exactly the same choices we're facing today. The evidence is all around us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to connect the dots and see the larger pattern. The question is whether we're ready to accept what that pattern might mean for our future, and whether we're wise enough to act on that knowledge while we still have the time itself might be our enemy in ways we've never considered. Not just the gradual erosion that wears down monuments and turns books to dust, but something far more insidious, the systematic rewriting of our own story every single time we rebuild from collapse. Here's what nobody talks about when they discuss the fall of civilizations. It's not just that knowledge gets lost. It's that the survivors actively change the narrative to make sense of their new reality. They take the fragments they remember and weave them into stories that fit their current understanding of the world. Real history becomes myth. Technology becomes magic. Facts become legends. We can watch this process happening even in our own recorded history. When medieval Europeans found Roman ruins, they couldn't believe ordinary humans had built such massive structures. So they invented stories about giants and supernatural builders. They had the evidence right in front of them, but they couldn't accept that their ancestors had possessed capabilities they themselves had lost. Now, imagine that same process happening after a complete civilizational reset. Imagine survivors finding the ruins of our cities, our factories, our technological infrastructure. Without the context to understand how these things worked, without the industrial base to maintain or reproduce them, what stories would they tell? A nuclear power plant might become a temple to the fire god. An airport could be remembered as a landing place for celestial chariots. A computer server farm might be seen as a mysterious shrine filled with magical thinking boxes. Over generations, these interpretations would harden into accepted truth, taught to children as the official history of the world. This rewriting process doesn't just change how people remember the past. It fundamentally alters their understanding of what's possible. If your ancestors explained advanced technology as divine intervention, you're not going to try to recreate it through human effort. You'll pray for the gods to return instead of working to rebuild what was actually lost. The most chilling aspect of this pattern is how thoroughly it could erase our existence from future memory, not just the physical traces of our civilization, but the very idea that people like us ever existed. Future generations might know that someone built the ruins they find, but they might not believe those builders were human beings with the same capabilities they possess. This explains why we keep finding archaeological anomalies that don't fit our timeline. Precision stonework that seems impossible for the tools we think ancient people had. Astronomical knowledge that appears too advanced for supposedly primitive cultures. Mathematical concepts encoded in monuments built by civilizations we're told were barely past the hunter-gatherer stage. Each discovery forces us to either expand our understanding of what ancient people could accomplish or come up with increasingly elaborate explanations for how they managed such feats with limited technology. But there's a third possibility we rarely consider, that these anomalies aren't evidence of primitive people achieving extraordinary things. They're evidence of knowledge inherited from previous advanced civilizations that we simply don't want to acknowledge existed. The academic establishment has a vested interest in maintaining the current narrative of human progress. Careers are built on the assumption that civilization developed in a neat, linear progression from simple to complex. If that assumption is wrong, if advanced societies have risen and fallen multiple times throughout history, then entire fields of study would need to be reconsidered from the ground up. So anomalies get explained away, dismissed as coincidences, or simply ignored when they don't fit the accepted framework. Out-of-place artifacts get mislabeled or hidden away in storage rooms. Archaeological sites that challenge the timeline get marginalized or reinterpreted to fit existing theories. This isn't necessarily a conscious conspiracy. It's just human nature. We see what we expect to see, and we explain away evidence that contradicts our fundamental assumptions about how the world works. But the cumulative effect is the same as if there were a deliberate cover-up. Inconvenient truths get buried under layers of academic orthodoxy. Meanwhile, the physical evidence keeps accumulating. Underwater structures that shouldn't exist if sea levels have been stable. Geological formations that appear to show human modification tens of thousands of years before we're supposed to have developed the necessary skills. Tool marks on bones that predate the accepted timeline for human technological development by hundreds of thousands of years. Each piece of evidence taken alone can be disputed or explained away, but collectively they paint a picture that's becoming harder and harder to ignore. The picture of a world where advanced human civilizations have existed far longer than our current models suggest, and where the rise and fall of complex societies might be a recurring pattern rather than a one-time historical progression. But accepting this possibility requires us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our own situation. If resets have happened before, if they're part of a natural cycle rather than unique historical accidents, then we're not the special generation that finally figured everything out. We're just the latest group to reach the same vulnerable peak that our predecessors reached before their worlds collapsed. The technologies we're most proud of, the achievements we think make us unique, might be rediscoveries rather than innovations. The problems we're grappling with, the challenges we think are unprecedented, might be variations on themes that have played out countless times before. This doesn't diminish our accomplishments, but it does put them in a very different context. We're not pioneers blazing new trails through unexplored territory. We're travelers on a well-worn path, following footsteps that have been erased by time, but not by the underlying structure of the journey itself. The implications of this shift in perspective are profound. If we're repeating patterns rather than writing new history, then we might be able to learn from the mistakes of our predecessors. We might be able to identify the warning signs that preceded previous collapses and take steps to avoid the same fate. But only if we can overcome our own psychological resistance to the idea that we're not as unique as we'd like to believe. Only if we can accept that our current understanding of human history might be fundamentally incomplete, built on assumptions that were created by previous cycles of forgetting and rewriting. Whether we're living through humanity's first rise to greatness, or simply the latest chapter in an endless cycle of forgetting and rediscovering, one thing remains certain. The choices we make right now will determine not just our own fate, but possibly the fate of whoever inherits this world after us. The evidence is scattered all around us, hidden in myths, buried in anomalies, encoded in the very gaps of our historical record. The question isn't whether resets have happened before, but whether we're brave enough to learn from patterns we've convinced ourselves don't exist, and wise enough to break a